I was born in 1929, and all my life and memories started at about age 4, when Hitler came to power, when everything changed. The people who were our friends became our enemies for no reason other than they'd been brainwashed. This happened to the children who were our friends and had been our friends all our lives. And suddenly, instead of playing with us, they would spit at us, kick us, do all sorts of things that little kids can think of doing, which left us very isolated. But I had my family. We lived with my grandfather, grandmother, a couple of uncles, my father, mother. And by the time I was 4, I was the eldest of 3. So my job was to look after my 3 brothers, who were much younger than, well, only years younger than me. My father insisted that I was the eldest, so I was the one who had to look after them. So he taught me to box and fight. It never occurred to him that gangs, you don't fight 1-to-1. You have a gang and you're on your own. So I'd come home with a black eye or a split lip. All he would say was, what did the other one look like? This went on and on. And we who'd never been frightened in our lives became terrified of these tall men in their black overcoats, their black hats with death's head badges, their jackboots. They frightened us so much that we would run a mile. They were the bullies. I looked forward, because I had very little to look forward to. I looked forward to going to school. Well, that was a non-event. We went to school, all the Jewish children were made to sit at the back, and no one spoke to us. Not the teacher, not the children. I was one of those strange children who wanted to learn. I learnt to read from what was put on the blackboard, and didn't learn to write until I was about 10 years old. My grandfather was the local butcher, and by the time I was about 6, 7, they had taken away his butcher shop, and he was very, very upset because he had a family to feed. There was no way he could say to my father, well, you feed your family, because my father was, well, he was just plain lazy. So my grandfather would go into the nearest town and try to find a boat to take us to what he called heaven, which was a place called Argentina, where there was lots of space, nobody to hurt us, lots of horses to ride. It did sound like heaven. But he'd come home time after time. No, nothing. And he came one day. My grandfather, this tall, soldiery-looking man, who was a guardsman in the First World War and lost an eye, came home crying. I was petrified. I didn't know men could cry. He'd found a boat, but there wasn't enough money for all of us. Just enough for my grandfather, my grandmother, 3 uncles and an aunt. And suddenly this big house was empty. Mother, as usual, was pregnant. And I was in charge of the children. When I was 7, there were 5 of us. They weren't known as the Wertheim children, which is our surname. They were known as Kerry's children, for my name in Germany was Kerry. I had to wash them and feed them and look after my mother, and do all the things that a 7-year-old shouldn't be doing. But to me it was very normal. I'd always done it. I never had dolls, I only had babies, who I loved dearly. My father, unfortunately, had a very big mouth and big teeth. He thought that because some of his friends weren't Jewish, and he was very little Jewish except by birth, he could say anything he pleased and get away with it. He soon found how wrong he was. One word spoken against Hitler, and he was in a concentration camp. And this happened numerous times. He was allowed out, believe it or not, because the commandant at the concentration camp was a gambler. And the notion of Jews was a little weedy man with glasses. Well, my father was not. He was a big man whose hobby was bodybuilding. So the commandant would bet on which Jew could carry the most bricks up a ladder, because they were already rebuilding Dachau, making it bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course my father always won. He would get a week's furlough, my mother would become pregnant, and he would vanish again. And one night, 2 of these hated, feared Gestapo men barged into our house and said to my mother, "We want your jewellery." All she had was a ring and a tiny pair of earrings. They took the ring off her finger and tore the earrings out of her ears. My brother and I spent the night trying to stop the bleeding in her ears. Our fears of the Gestapo were well founded. My father was home. It must have been maybe a year later. And the Gestapo came again. This time they said, "This house is too good for Jews. Out. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. You can take what you can carry." Can you imagine? 5, 6 children, one a babe in arms, another one 2, 3, 4, carrying pillows. For the synagogue had been opened for us, and the schoolroom filled with mattresses which the Jewish community had taken off their own beds so we could have somewhere to sleep. There was one toilet, one wash basin, and there we had to live, never being allowed out, being fed by the Jewish community. Until one night my father sounded almost hysterical, shouted, "Out, out, get out." We were in our 90s and the snow was almost as tall as me. We got outside and I remember seeing this gang of youths, Hitler youths in their uniforms, with bricks in their hands, waiting to kill us as we came out. Not all Germans are bad Germans. A couple of them smuggled us away and hid us in ice cellars. Next day, father's back in Dachau. Mother is sent to a camp for destitutes with a babe in arms. this camp, I can't even describe it. There were huts, and each room was about 4 foot wide and long. And there were people there, all sorts of people, not just Jewish. And I do emphasize that. There were Jehovah's Witnesses, there were gypsies, there were homosexuals. Not that I knew what a homosexual was. There were people who just didn't agree with Hitler, and this was a halfway house to a concentration camp. There was one stand of water, one pipe of water outside in the snow for every 40 odd people. And I think there were 2 toilets. And those conditions my mother had to live in. 3 brothers, a sister and I were sent to a Jewish orphanage in Kassel. A beautiful building, but once the doors open, you knew this is not a place to be, not a place that wants you, not a place you want to be. But we went in, because we had nowhere else to go. And there again, my family, my children were known as Kerry's children. We learned to scrub floors, cook meals, wash dishes. I was 8, Next brother was 7. Next one was 5. Next one was 3. My sister was 2. We lived a very austere life. I mean, we existed, we didn't live. And then Hitler decided that all Jews could only shop in one shop. I don't remember how many children were there. There must be between 30 and 40. And there was no food. I wasn't concerned about anybody else except my children. And once they started crying out from hunger, I had to do something about it. I went to the superintendent's office. Now, that was a very courageous thing to do, because we were all terrified of this woman. And I said, please, may we have some money? I want to go shopping. Now, I never described myself, I don't know why. I had long blonde plaits and blue eyes, and nobody could look less Jewish than me. So she looked me up and down. Even for an 8-year-old, I was very small, and gave us money. My brother came with me. He was a year younger. We went shopping. We must have been quite bright children, because we never went to the same shop twice. And we did this for quite a while. The children stopped crying. And suddenly we realized we were being followed by the Hitler Youth gang. They waited for us to get to the gate. They beat us up, took our baskets and threw us into the gate. Black eyes, split lip, and a few bruises. All the superintendent could say, I hope you've learnt your lesson. If you didn't know me, I was much too obstinate to learn lessons. Some weeks passed, my bruises healed, and back I went to the superintendent's office. She said, have you not learnt anything? I said, yes, my children are hungry. I can't allow this. I said, I will go and steal some money. I didn't even know what stealing was. I'd never even stolen an apple off a tree. I didn't have a clue. But I was more obstinate than she, and I still am. So she gave in. This time it didn't last very long. 2 weeks. Hitler Youths had told the Gestapo about it. They caught us at the gate, took us to Gestapo headquarters, and beat a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old with truncheons. My legacy was 2 faulty kidneys, subsequently 2 miscarriages. We weren't allowed out again. Suddenly one day, a photographer came to the orphanage. Now, there you didn't ask questions and you weren't told. You were told what to do, but not why you were doing it. And these photographs were taken evidently in lots of other places as well, not just our orphanage. And discovered subsequently there were thousands of photographs were sent all over the world. America had a quota system and took none, or maybe just a few. But I know that Canada did not take one. Great Britain, the smallest of all the countries, took 10,000 children between 1938 and 1939. We were known as the Kindertransport. Kinder is children, transport is transport. My photograph came to Swansea. I had no idea where Swansea was. I didn't know where Britain was. I didn't know where anything was. It came to a Jewish couple. He was 70, she was 50. They'd never had children or ever had anything to do with children. I remember standing at a railway station. I'd never seen a train. My mother and my father, and my little brother who could now walk. I was hugged and kissed. Father put me on the train and locked the door. I have no memory of that. The only memory I have is what I call my third eye, where while I'm looking at nothing, I'm looking at somebody, I'm looking at something, always I have this eye that sees my parents get smaller and smaller and smaller. I have no further recollection of that train journey at all. I remember coming to a place I now know to be Hamburg. The biggest piece of water I'd ever seen was the village pond. And now for the first time I saw the sea. A very terrifying experience. We were put on a boat. We ended up in Southampton at another train. This time, and this is not imagination, there was something in the air. I often remember this. It was as if we were released. There was no fear in the air, because we'd been living in fear. And on this long train, on every seat there was a little box. And the box held an apple, an orange, a banana, and some sweets. The train started. Out of curiosity, I had a look at this yellow thing and tried to eat it. And there were ladies going up and down the corridor, and one dashed into our compartment and said to me, "Child, you have to peel this." Well, the peel of a banana is absolutely atrocious. So she peeled it and insisted I start to eat it again, and I wouldn't. she forgot to tell me that the orange had to be peeled as well. So I didn't eat much fruit after that. We arrived in London in an enormous hall that went up in steps. We had big labels on us with our names and a number. With my luck, my surname started with a W. My name was Wertheim. Names were called out and children went down to meet somebody and walk away, and I'm sitting there thinking, nobody wants me, I want to go home. I never had much in the way of tears. I didn't think there was any point in it. Suddenly my name is called and I go down all these steps and there's this 8-foot man. I've never been very tall and he was 6 foot tall. With a lovely smile. He held out his hand and I walked out with him into a taxi. I didn't know what a taxi was. We went to another station, another train, and we sat opposite one another for 6 hours plus, not exchanging a single word. I had no word of English, he had no word of German. We arrived in Swansea to a civic reception, which is quite crazy. I only remember this little man with a big gold chain. And I remember this little lady, a rather tubby lady, who came and held my other hand. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, where I was, what was happening, until a man came who spoke to me in German. Now I'd not long left my mother and father, who I'd adored. And this man tells me, this old man and this old lady, are my mother and father. I think for the first time, I know for the first time, and I believe for the only time in my life, I got hysterical. So they took me, these two people took me to their home, where there was a table laid with the sort of food I'd never seen some of it, I didn't recognize it, and I certainly didn't want to eat it. So eventually I ended up upstairs. Next morning I was shown to this room, and I'd never seen a room that big all to myself. I was so tired I must have slept. Next morning I was shown where the toilet was. Went downstairs, and there's a table laid with all sorts of things that I'd never heard of. And this lady insisted on giving me burnt bread. Now, it started off the wrong colour. In Germany, bread is black. This was white, and it was burnt. And I didn't want to eat burnt bread. I'd been hungry before, but not burnt bread. And then she wanted to give me tea, and it looked rather nasty, so I didn't want that. She was getting more and more and more annoyed. And she'd only discovered this later. My name in Germany was Kerry, and she didn't like that. And I didn't know I had another name, so she kept calling Ellen, and I've no idea who Ellen was. Anyway, I pointed, which I really was not allowed to do, to some milk, and I had some milk, and she put some jam on a piece of this burnt bread and insisted I eat it. Next thing that happened, I'd never had my hair cut. I was terribly proud of my plaits, which I could sit on, and she didn't like it. She took me to a hairdresser and had my plaits cut off. I look in a mirror, and I don't know who this is in the mirror. Then she calls a name I don't understand, and I don't answer. And this lady's getting more and more frustrated. I am getting more and more fed up because I don't know what's happening. And that situation lasted for many, many years. But 3 weeks later I was sent to school, a very tough school, but I had the most wonderful, patient teacher who couldn't speak German either. But I learned English because I had no choice. And strangely enough, it's a language I came to love. I was in school for 3 years. I hadn't heard anything from my family. I arrived in Swansea in June 39. In August 39, I had one card from my mother telling me I had another sister whose name was Zilla, who I never saw. I did my best to please this woman, but we just couldn't do it. I just could not win, because my foster father loved me dearly, and she was jealous, and she didn't want to share his love or his affection. And I couldn't do anything right for doing wrong. When I was 11, my birthday is I was 12, my birthday is in January. I had a letter from the German Red Cross telling me that my mother, 4 brothers, and my sister had been sent by cattle truck to a place called Riga. As far as the Red Cross were concerned, they died. Oh, it's very hard for a just 12-year-old to take in. I couldn't touch that letter. I couldn't tear it up. But it was indelibly in my head. I could see this letter almost permanently in my head. And we were bombed, and the letter was destroyed. At least the paper was destroyed. Not the letter, that was in my head. I stayed in Kindertransport school until I was 12. Then I was sent to Clark's College, a commercial college. In those days you had to pay to go to college. I had to learn shorthand typing, besides all the commercial work. I had to learn geography, history, everything, you name it. And if I didn't do my homework the minute I got into the house, there my foster mother would be wagging her finger, saying, "We are paying for this." I took every exam there was, not because I was brilliant, but I was angry, very angry. I'd worked so hard, and still she wasn't satisfied. I left at 15 with all the qualifications I could find. I went for a job. There were 4 of us, and I was chosen because I had the best qualifications. And this job paid 17 and 6, 27 and 6. I can't remember. Anyway, I was only in there 2 weeks, and my foster father became ill. And my foster mother never worked. I mean, she would play bridge, and she would go to the cinema, and she'd go out for coffee, but not work. She would cook. She was a superb cook. And that's what I learned. And my foster father died, and I was heartbroken. So someone had to take over the business. It was haberdashery. So at 15, I took over the business. We had a workshop with 4 ladies who were old enough to remember my mother. I dealt with customers, I dealt with ordering, I dealt with finance. I'd go home and I'd have to wash, clean, porridge, baked, or for 10 shillings a week, out of which I'd have to pay my bus fare. We now lived in Sketty. She would go round the house with a white duster looking for dust. She never found any. We could not live together. It was impossible. There was nothing I could do. I could do nothing right for doing everything wrong. Nothing pleased her. And I was desperate. Anyway, one little story. To sheer mischief, I wasn't allowed to go out with non-Jewish boys. And I met this non-Jewish boy. We went to a little cinema together in the back row, hugging and smoking a cigarette for the first time. I'm 15. I didn't like it. And I looked up and I saw one of my mother's cronies get up, run for the door and go back, and evidently went to see my mother, who was waiting for me at the door, wagging her finger as usual, daring me to go out with a non-Jewish boy. Really, I shouldn't. I don't know where the language came from, but I was flabbergasted. And after that, I was just a little more careful. Unfortunately, I didn't like the Jewish boys. But she didn't take that. I mean, as far as she was concerned, this was a law. I did not go out with non-Jewish boys. I was allowed to go out with her nephew, who was 8 years older than me, and the only thing we had in common was we were very good ballroom dancers. We enjoyed that. And when I was 18, he asked me to marry him, and out of sheer desperation, I said yes. And we were married at 19. Now, I now had a mother-in-law who was the sister of my foster mother. So not only had I dealt with one, I was now in the hands of another. So I went from the frying pan straight into the fire. It was a marriage that was made in hell. That's where it stayed for 20 years. The only thing I can say about it is that I can't regret it, because I had my daughter and my son, and I lost 2 children. In retrospect, I realize that I too was wrong. I married for the wrong reasons. I married to get away from my foster mother, and I wanted children. Unfortunately, the man I chose should never have married because he hated children. I stuck it for 20 years, and the day before my daughter went to university, I left. I've no idea what that last straw was, but I'd been working for a garage as a service manager, the only one in Great Britain, only female service manager. And I had a little Morris 1000, which the boys in the workshop kept going for me. I packed some things and put them in the car and left. I went to Jean, my friend's house, knocked at the door, and she said, "Oh, you've done it. Good, I'll make up a bed." This friend, we'd been together since I was 15 and she's 16 and a half. It's now 2011. After 66 years of friendship, she died in November 2010. A great heartbreak for me. I had worked. I'd already developed arthritis. I had spondylitis in my neck, so I could I was paralysed in my right arm for quite a while. I took a job in an estate agent's office for my husband. Was very work shy. It seems I attract men who are work shy. One being my father, the next one being my first husband. I had quite a number of jobs and I enjoyed them. And I met the man who later became my husband. In 1972 we got married. My first husband married in 1970. And unfortunately, by 1972, she'd thrown him out. That's a bio. But my life hasn't been easy. I've adored my children, and I still do, and I adore my grandchildren, so I'm very, very fortunate, for I have my family. I've not really spoken much about my father. When I left Germany, instead of going back to Dachau, he decided there was nothing he could do for my mother or my family that I'd left. So he decided to escape. And within a month of my coming to Britain, 6 months, I suddenly had a card from the Isle of Wight. My father had escaped. To the day he died, he would never tell anybody how. And he ended up in Britain. I saw him once again in Australian uniform. He joined the Pioneer Corps and was being sent to Australia on a hellboat called the Dunera. That's another story. It's a rather nasty one. And there, again in a camp, and eventually released, he remarried, never had any more children, and never spoke about his children except about me. And for some unknown reason, whenever he spoke about me, I was in London. Now, originally when he went to Australia, I used to get letters from him for quite a while, in German, and I can read German, I can't speak it. I would return them in English. And he would send me parcels with tinned fruit. And then suddenly I heard nothing, complete nothing. When I first came. When I was 18, the law then was that you couldn't get married without permission until you were 21. So I wrote asking for permission. He gave his permission and sent me my new cheque and told me he'd remarried. From that day on to the time he died, I never ever heard from him again. Never. I sent him letters by special delivery, by registered mail, by hand, and I know he received them. He never, ever contacted me again. 1981, my son had just married. I kept getting letters from this lady who was his third wife or widow, whatever she was then, saying that we must come to Australia. My father had died, I think 5 years before. She'd only been married to him for 5 years. And we could use his car and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Colin and I decided he'd just retired And we would make this into a big holiday, and we went to Australia for 4.5 months. After about 4 weeks, this lady who had not moved from our house, we had walking in temperatures of 100 degrees, decided that her doctor had said she mustn't rush around so much. She hadn't rushed anywhere, so she couldn't see us as often. Oh, without her we wouldn't have gone. But she had brothers and sisters who gave us a wonderful time. And we returned here and corresponded with the brothers and sisters. And then my husband decided that he'd love to go back. Well, that journey is an impossible journey for an athletic. And I was much too much in pain. And I said, sorry, there's no way I can make a 24-hour journey again. Anyway, he decided he would go on his own. To this day, I swear he had a spare ticket. Well, while he was away, there was an advertisement in the Evening Post about a trip to Israel. Now, I'd always wanted to go. And at about 2 days' notice, I decided to go to Israel. And while quite enjoying it, because I like history, I went to Yad Vashem, which is a Holocaust museum, to try and find out what had happened to my brothers and sisters and my mother. We went through about 3 hours of letters, papers, anything, but no name, nobody ever heard of the name Wertheim. I came home. I'd had a holiday. I'd been very upset at Yad Vashem, which is the name of the museum. And the gentleman who was helping me there gave me some addresses to write to Germany, where they have a tracing agency. So I wrote. In the meantime, this gentleman who'd been helping me had found the name Wertheim in a corner of a letter. This lady had been there 10 years before me and lived in New York. And as soon as I received that, I also received a letter from the German Red Cross telling me that in 1941, as the Red Cross had told me before, they had been sent to Riga in Latvia. But this letter said that there they had been shot. They were taken out of the trucks. My mother, 4 brothers and 2 sisters. They were all together, and they wanted to separate my mother from my brothers and sisters. And my eldest brother, was then 12, stood in front of them and said, "We're going to die. We died together." And they were shot there and then. My eldest brother was 12. My youngest sister was 2. And that's all I knew about it. Now, for years I'd been watching the television with people going to camps and gas chambers, trying to see if I could find any member of my family. And now I knew this was not on. I lived with it. I mean, I literally lived with it for years and years and years. And I tried so hard to come to terms with it, but I couldn't. And after many years, I was contacted by someone who had known of 2 brothers, teenage brothers, who lived in Kassel, where my family were taken from, and went in the same cattle truck with them. And because they had Russian names, they were in a work camp, and they were released after the war by Russians and sent back to Kassel, where they were asked to write affidavits of all they had seen. And they verified every word that I'd been told about the death of my family. So I had to accept it. I had no choice. In 2000, I belonged to an organization called AJR, Jewish Refugee. We have a magazine. And there, in the magazine, it said anybody wishing to go to the opening of a memorial in Riga, in Latvia, contact such and such. The service was in December. I had no idea of the cold in December in Latvia, but I decided to go. Now I've been using a stick all these years, and I went to a very foreign place, freezing. I had more clothes and I could barely walk. And I met some other people at the airport, and we went to this center of the forest where the memorial was being opened. We stood on 12 inches of ice in the snow, about 1,000 people. I looked around. I thought there was something wrong with me. I couldn't cry. The emotion was so high, nobody could cry. And there were representatives of towns that had sent people to their deaths in Riga, who were laying wreaths and laying documents with the names of the people they had sent to their death. We stood in the middle of a forest on little hills, and each hill was a mass grave. My stick and I walked up every hill, crawled up every hill, said prayers for my family, for I didn't know which of these hills held them. I said my goodbyes. And I have the picture of this memorial and of these mass graves in my head. I now know where they died. It doesn't really help, but I was able to say my goodbyes. That was very hard. Very hard. But just knowing and being in the same place has done something, given me a closure that I've been wanting for 70 years. Those 70 years, 72 years, I've spent in Swansea. She's been very, very good to me. There's just one P.S. In 70 years, I have never had anybody say an anti-Semitic word to me. In the last 30 years, I've been lecturing to adults. 14, I don't know how many years, I've been lecturing in schools. The schools have been my joy. when you hear people speak about the yobs on street corners, I have to correct them. I go to these schools, and the reaction of what they call yobs is unbelievable. As I walk on stage, you can read their minds. I've spoken to as many as 250 at a time. They look at me, and you can read it. What has this old woman got that would interest us? I'm standing there reading their minds, and I start telling them my story. And suddenly a wave of pity, sympathy if you like, comes over. And when I'm finished, and I always finish by saying, I am a Jew and proud of it, but I quote Jesus, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. These youngsters, aged possibly 14, 17, some even younger, come up to me and touch my hand. And such a wave of love comes that I'm so sorry I can't do it anymore. At 80 I had to stop. My body test says I can only do so much. But I've had letters from those youngsters, yobs as you'd call them, saying how much they appreciated, how much they had spent, how many times, years they've spent learning from books, from television, from teachers, and an hour with me, they'd learned more than they had in the rest of the time. But it's the love that mattered, and their understanding, which I know is real. For the letters they've sent me, I have about 600 plus, are wonderful. I went to the same schools many times, and I miss that very badly. For I have a great need to know that the future generations will not make the same mistakes as the past, and that this Holocaust will never be repeated. It's a very stupid thing to say, actually. It's been repeated in miniature all over the world. In Rwanda, in Bosnia, in every African country. Religion seems to be the be-all and end-all of life. It isn't. It's do unto others as you would have them do unto you.